So 3,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, it's hard to put into context, there was a man named David, and he had been anointed king over Israel. But there was a problem. Does anyone know the problem? There was already a king. There was already a king, and David gets anointed king, but after that, and no one really knows but his family that he was anointed king, and so he goes off and he kills Goliath, right? Remember David and Goliath? There's that wild story. And so David's fame just kept growing and growing, and then he would lead troops out into battles, and he would win the battles, right? And so it would just grow and grow. In fact, they started making songs about David, and it was something like Saul, who was the current king. They were like, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands, right? And so there was these songs just claiming that David was so much better than the current king, and he knew that he was anointed to be king. Well, eventually Saul tries to kill David a couple of times, but he's literally on the hunt, and David is got his crew of merry men, and they're running around hiding. There's crazy stories about hiding in a cave. I mean, if you're not reading 1 Samuel, I don't know what you're doing with your weekdays, right? Read 1 Samuel, it's excellent. And so what happens is they get hungry, and because they're hiding, and so they're not producing food. There's no Walmart, right? You gotta kind of grow your food or livestock, kill your food, and so they end up in the land of Nob. All right, I think it's N-O-B, right? N-O-B, yeah. And they're hungry and they're desperate, and so David stops there, and he stops at the tabernacle. So the tabernacle was the pre-temple, right? And so the temple in Jerusalem hadn't been built yet. David's son, Solomon, ultimately builds the temple. So currently there's it's a tent, right? It's a really fancy tent called the tabernacle. And so inside the tabernacle, like this is their portable temple, but they treated it exactly like the temple. And so David goes in, and he goes to the priest, Ahimelech, and he says, we're on mission here from the king. And from the king, and we're hungry, and so if you wouldn't mind, could you feed us? Right? And so he's lying, right? Because they're actually hiding. So he's lying to the priest. Not a really great start. So the priest goes, well, the only thing we have is the bread of the presence. Bread of the presence was only for the priest to eat. Like there's rules against anyone else eating the bread of the presence, but David is able to convince them to give them the bread, and David persuades Ahimelech to give it to him, and all of his men are fed. And side note, he also gets Goliath's sword was there also, which is super cool. So he's carrying around Goliath's sword after this. It's full of this kind of drama that's going on. It's desperate choices have consequences, and Saul later hears about what Ahimelech did and kills all the priests of Nob for helping David and his men. And the only one that got out was Abiathar, who ends up joining David and his clan. And so it's full of tension. God's anointed is on the run, hungry men depending on him. A holy law is bent to mercy, and a lie ends in tragedy. So, fast forward 1,000 years. And we're going to run into a very similar issue around eating and the law. Okay? So Jesus has his disciples back, and if you've been here through chapter 11, you know that the disciples weren't there, right? Or at least they weren't mentioned. We're pretty sure, Jesus had sent them out on mission. And so now they're back, and they're hungry, right? So let's pick up in your Bibles, if you have it, chapter 12. We are beginning chapter 12. So it says this: at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. So I want to, before we kind of dive into the meat of this, I really love some of this. I want to stick up for the Old Testament here for a second, because I love the Old Testament. I know sometimes it gets a bad rap for being kind of angry and judgmental or whatever. But there are, I was trying to find, and if you can find that I'm wrong, I would love to know, because I was looking for some laws in non-Jewish religions that were declared for the poor, laws written specifically for the poor in the ancient world. I really struggled to find any, but the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, is full of some really cool laws around the poor and the neglected. So if you want to check these out, you don't have to go to them right now. You can look them up later. But I remember reading when I had to be like 15 when I first trying to get through Leviticus as a 15-year-old is not easy, y'all. All right, it was one page a night. I'm going to read one page and then I'm going to go to sleep. Right, and so, but here it is, Leviticus 19. It says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare or gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God." And then in Deuteronomy 25, or in Deuteronomy, it says this. Did I give you this? Yeah, okay, 25. "If you go into your neighbor's standing grain," right? And so this is kind of the picture of the disciples, right? They're kind of going through the standing grain. "You may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain." Right? So there's laws. This is so cool. And that's why it's like, if you can find some laws in other ancient religions that are like, I'd love to hear them. But these laws are written into the scriptures. And so, like, and I'm saying that, so our disciples, they're allowed to walk by grain. Like, so a lot of your passageways would go through these grain fields. And so it was just, you were allowed, as long you weren't allowed to have a bucket, right? So there's these certain rules to make sure you didn't starve to death. And so that's where we find our disciples. They're eating their food in a design system, but the problem is it's the Sabbath, right? It's the Sabbath. And so it's not exactly David's problem, the same problem, but it is a breaking of the law around eating. And so let's jump to verse 2, and it says this. It says, "When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.'" Right? And so this, when I was kind of diving into this verse, it sounds very like kind of polite, like the Pharisees were very much like, "Hey Jesus, we just happen to notice." Right? And it's like you can read it that way, but it's actually, when I really kind of dove into some of the Greek, I put it up here. Hopefully this makes sense. This is a literal rendering from the Greek into the English, and hopefully that shows up. I don't know if it really does. I knew we'd maybe have a problem with that. But so a literal reading of that first line would read like this. And the English is clunky, and I think that's why they write it the way they do. "But the Pharisees, having been watching, kept on saying to him." Right? So that's different. Isn't that different? Right? It's not just this kind of one time or hey, by the way, right? Matthew is using surveillance and pestering language. Right? This isn't they happen to see Jesus. This was we're looking for Jesus to screw up, right? We're watching for Jesus and his disciples to mess up, and when they do, we're going to get them. And then not only that, it's this pestering of, "Hey Jesus, what about your disciples? What about your disciples?" It's like all of them kind of harping on Jesus about his disciples. And when I thought about that, I thought that still happens today. That's kind of still the way the world works. I played a lot of basketball as a teenager, and I was generally one of the bigger people that played, so that's why I liked it, right? And so one of my best buddies, though, was very small, and in fact had to get hormone treatment for his growth, right? He was a small guy, but we were best friends, and we would always play, and the whole idea was get the mismatch. You familiar? You know what a mismatch? Get the mismatch, right? So it's like what we want to do is the big guy would guard me and the small guy would guard him. So we wanted to switch it up. And if I could it's called getting you got a mouse in the house. That's what I don't know if I might be way over everyone's heads, right? But if you got a small guy, if I got a small guy on me, it's called getting a mouse in the house, and it's very easy. So you're picking the bad matchup to score, and that's really what's happening with this story is that the Pharisees they're looking for the weakest link. Remember that show was that you are the weakest link. Anybody finish it? Goodbye. Remember? Okay, no, a couple people. I love that, right? But they're picking on the weakest link, and so this is still, I think, what happens in our world today, where when I have conversations with people about Jesus, and I work in construction, so I do get to talk to non-church goers, frequently. In fact, I had a wild conversation that I'm sure I will get to bring up sometime about a guy working at these apartments that we're building. I'm getting way off track. When people pick on Jesus, they're usually doing it through his disciples. It's like, because when I talk to people about Jesus, that's where I was, they go, well, yeah, but this church I grew up in. Yeah, but this pastor that I knew. Yeah, but when I went to, my parents, were super Christians, and they weren't loving it all. Or right, so it's always pointing to the disciples, right? It's always pointing to Jesus' followers. And so what I always try to do is always point people back to Jesus. Listen, I know I could tell you the same stories. Listen, God knows all those stories, but do you have a problem? Can you name a problem that you have with what Jesus has done or said? And it kind of stuck. You kind of get stuck because listen, everybody loves. They love merciful Jesus. They love poor loving Jesus, right? They love healing Jesus. It's like we love all of this Jesus stuff. Like Jesus, that's all good stuff. Not a fan of the people. But the problem really is that they're not a fan of Jesus as Lord, right? I mean, that's really the problem. It's like, I like all this stuff, and we've been talking about this for 3 weeks now, about being fans, right? It's like, you can even be like a distant fan or watching from a distance going, I don't know about all of that, but I definitely know I don't want Lord Jesus. I want to be Lord of my life, no matter how bad I am at it. And I've done it myself. I'm bad at it. When I wanted to be Lord, I did not do well in life. And so we go back to the text. And this is where the David story shows up. So verse 3, and I'm going a little slow today. He said to them, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? Now listen, by saying have you not read to the Pharisees is a slap in the face, right? I mean, because they would, it's like asking a baker, have you heard of flour, right? It's like that kind of deal. Like they know it by heart. And if he would have said, have you not read what David did when his companions were hungry? At that point, they already know they lost this, right? And Jesus is going to keep going, right? But they have already lost this. And so they not only know exactly what Jesus is talking about, and Jesus is going to keep going. Verse 3, he said to them, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? How he entered the house of God and they ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests? So as we get through chapter 12, Matthew is picking up on a lot of greater than themes. And we've seen a lot of this throughout this entire gospel, where Matthew is trying to paint Jesus as greater than all these other Jewish people or ideas, right? And we can go back through a few of them. When the angel gives Jesus his name, tells Mary to name him Jesus. That's Yeshua, which is Joshua, right? And Joshua led the people of Israel into the promised land. And so Matthew is saying Jesus is a better Joshua, right? And when on the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus is giving the laws, the new laws, right? That's the same like Moses on Mount Sinai, Matthew on the Sermon on the Mount, right? Matthew is a better lawgiver. Matthew is a better Moses, right? And then last week, we talked about Jesus. Did I say Matthew? I did. Jesus is a better, maybe Matthew, but Jesus definitely. Jesus is a better Moses. Jesus is a better Torah. Last week, we said Jesus was a better Torah, that instead of running to the Torah that Jesus said, come to me. And so Matthew is really, remember, his audience is very Jewish, so he's trying to stack Jesus up above all of these other things. And so he mentions David. He's almost taking a shot at David. Because David, remember, is he is the national hero, right? He is the guy. He's the one, you're waiting for his descendants, right, to save you, right? So David's the guy, and he's taking a little bit of a shot. It's kind of like it'd be like making fun of Tom Hanks in Lakewood, right? You just better tread softly, right? Because I heard he's a big deal here. Am I? Okay, yeah, I thought so. I thought I was right about that. I've always tread lightly around him now. David lies. So David lies. Jesus brings up this 1,000-year-old story. And it's not a pretty story. David lies to the priests about why he's there, says that they're on kingly orders, not hiding from him. He says that they were clean enough for the bread, which we don't know if he's already lied about one thing. Maybe he's lying about that. And the priests have not paid with their lives for helping him. And so Jesus is like, hey, you're a hero. You're David. You're your guy. He did way worse than what we're doing. Like, way worse. And you give him mercy, right? You've given him mercy for really an awful story. I mean, an awful thing that he did, and it ended up costing the lives of many. And so Jesus doesn't stop there. He takes it a step further, Matthew 12:5. Or have you not read, there he goes again, right? It's like explaining a ladder to a roofer, right? In the law, that on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless. So if David got mercy, then what about the priests in that very temple? Every Sabbath they work. Every Sabbath, all day long, the priests work. That's what he's saying. And yet no one calls them lawbreakers. Why is that? So Jesus is backing the Pharisees into a corner that they can't wiggle out of. And now, many of our English, Jesus actually uses really harsh language here, and it comes off a little soft again. Sometimes we're really soft. I think our Bible translators can be softer on some folks. But Jesus is using really strong language. He says, it says break the law, but Jesus says, actually use the word profane, right? It profanes the law. They're making a mockery of the Sabbath. Your priests are making a mockery of the Sabbath because they work all Sabbath long, and they're not found guilty. And so he's playing with them. He's intentionally using this strong language to point out that priests work on Sabbath, and yet they aren't guilty. Why is that? It's because the service of the temple, don't miss this part, the service of the temple and doing temple duties trumps the law. That's what's given. It's given priority over the law. Service to the temple is given priority to the law. And then watch what Jesus says next. I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. You can't just say that. Like, that's a wild thing to say, that you're greater than the temple. And I was trying to figure out a way to really compare this so we could really wrap our heads around it. But it would essentially, imagine someone coming in on Easter Sunday in the middle of worship, standing up and going, something greater than Easter is here. And it doesn't even really grasp it. It's still not even really close to what's happening here, because the temple, right, is not just one gathering place for some Jews, right? Like we have this church, and there's a church, down the road that's also a Methodist church, and then there's 17 churches in other directions. Like, that's not what it was. There was one temple for all people. But not only that, the temple was understood to be the dwelling of the Spirit of God. That is where you went to worship, that is where you went to make sacrifices, because that's where God was. It was central to all of Jewish worship, and even more, it was understood to be the dwelling place of God's Spirit. And so listen, had they been in Jerusalem when Jesus said this, instead of just in some random field, they probably would have tried to stone him. Right, because this is like your claim. This is a divine claim, right? To say that now I'm greater than the place where the Spirit of God. You believe the Spirit of God dwells. That's what he just said to him, right? That is the claim. He's going, I am the Spirit of God is on me. Like I am the one that you come to now. Like these are huge claims, and if they'd have been anywhere with any kind of authority, they would have had him stoned, right? Because if you go to John, when John says something about he mentions being before Abraham. They want to throw stones at him, right? They actually pick up the stones, but that's because they're in Jerusalem, where they have a lot more. They got a lot more backup, right? They might even be outnumbered here by Jesus' disciples. So, to me, that is God. That is Jesus claiming to be God. Verse 7. But if you had known what this means, now everyone together, Do this one with me. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, right? That's our through line, right? That's the line we're supposed to remember. Brendan was trying to kind of get through your heads a couple weeks ago, right? I desire mercy and not sacrifice. You would have condemned the guiltless. And so remember, this is our anchor phrase through the entire gospel. But remember, it's from the prophet Hosea. And so Hosea was criticizing the emptiness of Jewish rituals. Like, he's like, you guys are just walking the steps. Like, you're just going through the motions. And it's really not what any of this is about, right? You're just trying to see who can get the most stars on their chart, right? And it's like that's nothing. That has nothing to do with this. That's not who we are. That's not what we're doing. That's not what we're about. I desire mercy, not law following, right? The law wasn't meant to complement itself. Like the law wasn't made in and of itself just like, oh, how beautiful is the law, right? It's like that law is. It's like that's not, it's the spirit we've been talking about. Paul says it beautifully in Romans. The New Living Translation actually says it very, very clearly. Romans 3, verse 20 says, "For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands. The law simply shows us how sinful we are." Let me just read that again. "For no one can ever be made right with God by doing what the law commands. The law simply shows us how sinful we are." And so the purpose of the law is to go, oh, I need help, right? And so when we're reading the Sermon on the Mount going like, hey, if you hate your brother, you murdered him. You go, oh, I need help, right? Like if you thought with lust, you committed adultery. Oh, it's like, I need help, right? I cannot do the law, right? I can't uphold the law, but I have Jesus. And that's where we go, I need Jesus. But Jesus isn't done saying wild things yet, okay? This is the last one. "For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." So just in the last 2 weeks, Jesus is over the Torah, the Old Testament law. Jesus is over David. Jesus is over the temple. And now Jesus is over Sabbath. Now, what's unique about Sabbath in the Ten Commandments? It existed before them, right? We have Sabbath in Genesis, in the opening of Genesis. So it says this. So the Sabbath, and I just want to read this for you because I want to say it correctly. The Sabbath is unique because it's not just a command given at Sinai, right, Mount Sinai. It's a rhythm built into creation that God self-rested, right, which means that when Jesus says the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he's not just claiming authority over a rule, okay? He's claiming authority over creation itself, right? It's because it's been in the beginning. So even over God's own rest. And so that's either blasphemy, or it's the clearest proof that Jesus is God on earth. And so the question becomes now, what do we do with this? With Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. It's like, well, what does that mean for me? Because I don't know what to do with that. One of the things that stood out to me in all of this that we've been covering is that the church has a history of wanting or making other disciples act just like they do. Right? It's like, I have an idea, like God has given me a way that I should live, when I should read my Bible, how often I should pray, right? And so I have my rhythm. And so then what we tend to do is go, oh, you're not doing the same rhythms as me. I get an extra star, right? My star chart is getting full, right? It's like those types of things. So all the things I think God wants me to do, I won't put on others. That's really, for me, that's something that I'm taking away from. So Paul says it in 1 Corinthians 6. He says it like this. "All things are permitted for me, but not all things are beneficial. All things are permitted for me, but I will not be dominated by anything." So in other words, not everything that looks religious is good for the soul. Not every ritual is life-giving. The real test is mercy. Does what I do bring life, or does it crush life? The way that I live. Do our actions bring about that John 10:10, I've come that you might have life and have it to the full? Like when we act as Christians, when we are functioning as the church, are we bringing life, or are we crushing spirits? Right? That's where it begins. And then the second thing is that Jesus is our Sabbath rest. St. Augustine said this in his Confessions writing. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And so last week I said that when Jesus said, come to me, remember last week I said, Jesus, come to me, all who are weary. And I said it didn't really mean physically, right? I said it was really about the law and about rest from the expectations of religious elites. But this part is about physically taking a break. So the Sabbath is this idea that, and I loved it in the Old Testament, it was, you're only going to work 6 days, everybody else is going to work 7, and you're going to win every time. You're going to win every time, right? So it's like that's the idea of Sabbath. So like, that's the idea of tithing, right? It's like the rest of the world's operating on 90% of their income, or 100% of their income. You're operating on 90%, and watch you win, right? That's this idea of trusting God with our first, with the first of our day, with the first of our offerings, the first of our checks, right? All these things are about having faith that God is in control. And so while they were nation building on their way to the promised land, they didn't work as hard as everyone else. When they built the promised land, they were not working as hard as everyone else. And so if you're working yourself to death, you're not using faith. Even when some things do, you gotta rest. If something needs cleaned, you still gotta rest. There will always, I have 3 kids, there will always be something to clean, right? I mean, there will always be laundry, there will always be all these things, but you've got to take time to let God be the center. Sabbath is a time for us to admit that we aren't the center of the world, making it all happen, that we have a life giver and a center of our own that we trust. And so I rest even though there's plenty of things to do. And so if you're not taking time to breathe, you aren't trusting God. Where's my band at? You guys can start heading on up. I know I didn't give you I didn't give you a clue there. I'll close on this. Martin Luther, the reformer, says this: the spiritual rest which God especially intends in this commandment is that we not only cease from our labor and trade, but much more that we let God alone work in us. So it's not just about physical rest, but it's about giving God time to work inside of you. And so if your Sabbath rest is doom scrolling through social media, you're not resting, right? You're not resting there. Especially if I'm so glad I've been off the last 3 weeks, right? It's like, you're not resting. There's no way you're resting. I'm barely resting. I can't watch it, and I can't even see it all. It's happening all the time. That's not rest. Are you letting God do a work in you? So Sabbath isn't just about taking a break from work. It's about making room for God. It's about trusting him enough to stop striving, to rest, and to let him be the one that carries the weight. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. And the good news is that means he's Lord of your rest, too. God bless you, church.